Welcome to the Plant Report, a radio show that educates about the green world one plant at a time. The Plant Report is a new educational resource about plants, herbal medicine, ethnobotany, and the human-plant relationship. Listen to our podcast, read our blog, watch our videos, and learn from experts and the plants. The Plant Report is a project of Sustainable World Radio and is hosted by Jill Cloutier. Thanks for listening to the Plant Report because every plant has a story. Our plant today is amaranth. We'll be chatting about the Amaranth family with seed saver and ecosystems builder Andrew McMillion. Andrew works on a small farm in Norway where he stewards a large and growing collection of plants. Andrew's a board member and guild leader for several guilds in the Norwegian seed savers. Welcome to the Plant Report, Andrew.
Thanks, Jill. Glad to be here.
It's great to have you here. And the Amaranth family is a broad and bountiful plant family. And members range from beets to Orach, I think. And I hope I'm saying that right. Today we'll be talking about some of your favorite members in this family. And so I'd love just to dive into Amaranth. It's a huge family. And can you tell us a bit about maybe the Latin name of the family and then a few of the broad characteristics of this family?
Absolutely. So the genus Amaranth has about 75 species in it, and that's sort of what we think of when we think of amaranth. But the greater family Amaranth, or Amaranthacea, is how you say it in Latin, and it has about 2,000 species in it. A lot of these species are plants that we know, so we don't really think about them as being linked together. So, for instance, beet, we think of that as being a root crop. But it's very closely related to Swiss chard, and there's a whole bunch of plants in that family that are just amazing plants. They're all really easy to save seeds from, and they don't have very many problems with pests and very easy to grow. And so I've really connected with quite a large variety of species in the family.
That's one thing I really liked when we discussed talking about amaranth, is you did say that the amaranth family supports you by providing you with food for 9 months of the year. And that's so valuable to have that close relationship with plants like that support you.
Absolutely. Especially as far north as we live, because it's not so easy to have something fresh to eat 9 months out of the year. This far north, most people have to can or dry or freeze stuff to do that. So we're quite lucky to be able to find a way to do that. But to make that work, you have to sort of ride waves, as I call them, where you go from one variety to the next and you find out which ones do best at different times of the year. And so I think about it very much in terms of loops and cycles, which is something that you get into more. The more you get into ecology, you see how everything turns in a cycle. So I kind of like to start at the end and the beginning, which for me is with spinach. Spinach is the last of the amaranth family plants that I sow quite late in the summer or early fall. And it doesn't die with frost. It manages to survive all the way up to around minus 15 Celsius. Not sure what that is Fahrenheit, but quite cold. So this winter, it only got to minus 16 in Norway, where I live, which is a very mild winter. And so the spinach survived the whole winter. It never died back. But usually, even in the greenhouse, it'll die back and it'll look like it's totally gone. But then as soon as it's warm enough, it'll start coming back again. And even when you have nighttime temperatures of minus 10 or 15, you can still have spinach growing in a greenhouse. And the interesting thing is that it's much sweeter when it's cold. The colder it is, the more sugars it makes. So the spinach you buy in the store doesn't taste anything like it should taste. A real good spinach is sweet like strawberries. So for me, I eat spinach all the way up until Christmas. Around mid-December is usually when I close up the greenhouse. The snow starts to get too big, too heavy to go in and out. And then in the springtime again, in early March, I can go in and there can be a meter or meter and a half of snow outside. But in the greenhouse, by then we're so far north that the sun is we're getting quite a lot, about 10 hours of sun in early March. And so the spinach does very well under those conditions. And it's not the only thing that grows. I have a lot of onions, different kinds of onions that grow also, and kale that I overwinter. So there's a lot of stuff growing on already in March, surrounded by snow. But that's the first and the last wave. And spinach also goes to seed when there's more than 12 hours light usually, and that happens in April already in Norway. So it's important to know when to sow it. If you sow it the wrong time, like I did the first year I sowed spinach, it just went straight to seed, and I was like, "What's this? I didn't get any spinach out of this wave at all." So I wasn't really happy with it the first year. But yeah, so knowing when to sow a plant is really important, and also knowing how much of a wave that you sow that you want to save for seed. So with spinach, I only save maybe 10% of what I sow for seed, and which is really sort of the last part of, once you've gone through the whole production wave of the plant, then you see it starts to go to seed, and then you weed out all the ones that bolt early, because you don't want to encourage it to bolt to go to seed too early. You want it to stay in its leafy form as long as possible. And then once you have, it has both male and female plants, separate male and female plants. And you can see the males because they don't have seed, they make pollen. If you tap them, you can see they spread their pollen around. And so you watch that happen for a while until the males kind of start to wilt, they get brown. Then you weed them out because they're not any use anymore. They're just taking up space and nutrients. And that gives more space to the females that are left, that then bulk up and put on and give you a bunch of seed. So that's sort of one cycle of spinach, which is the beginning and the end. Before the spinach starts to bolt, so as soon as the ground starts to warm up enough, but when there's still frost at night, I start sowing the second wave, which is Atriplex hortensis, or mountain spinach.
Is that also known as Orach too?
Yes, it's quite similar to lamb's quarters. So a lot of people will think that it's just a red lamb's quarters, but it's not. It's got much broader leaves, much deeper taste. It doesn't have a sort of a powdery film that lamb's quarters can get when they get mature. So this plant, even if it's a good meter tall, you can still cut it right down to like 1 or 2 leaves, and it'll grow back again. So it's an amazing plant. You really hardly need any space at all for it to grow a really good crop of this Atriplex hortensis, or mountain spinach.
Does this also grow in warmer weather as well?
Yeah. It grows. It's prolific. It's a prolific plant, and I only usually save seeds from very few plants because there's so much seed on them. It's like lamb's quarters, very, very prolific. But yeah, it's related in the same family as beet, and you can kind of see the relation in the fact that all the it's so red that the beta carotene just sort of oozes out of it when you wash it, so the water kind of gets that red color, and you can feel the vitamins and the nutrition in it when you're eating it. And again, it's very, very easy to save seeds, but the important part is that even most plants, if they start to sprout and they get a frost, that'll kill a lot of little sprouts. But with Atriplex hortensis, you can have -7 degrees or 8 degrees at night, and the plant will still continue to grow during the daytime, which is quite remarkable considering that you're just broadcast sowing this seed, on open ground. So it's an establishment plant. In between those two, I have a perennial called Hublitzia Temnoides, which is a very popular permaculture plant. It's a hardy climbing perennial that tolerates shade. And it was introduced to gardens in the Nordic region about the 1870s. And it's become very, very popular in the Norwegian seed savers and the other seed saving organizations in the Nordics, but also in the States.
It's great to have a perennial green, right?
Absolutely. And a big part of what we do in the Norwegian Seed Savers is try to promote more perennials. And there's quite a lot of perennials that do quite well in the north. And Stephen Barstow, who's the leader, he wrote a book called Around the World in 80 Plants. And most of the plants in there are perennials. There's a whole category called mountain plants, bonsai plants, which are very popular.
Does Hablitzia have a similar flavor to spinach, or is it a different type of flavor?
All of these plants have fairly similar taste. There's one that I don't grow too much. I grow some, which is related, somewhat similar to Hablitzia. It's also a perennial. It's called Good King Henry.
Hmm.
And that one has a kind of a bitter taste that some people really don't like, but that taste disappears as soon as you cook it.
Hmm.
But what's special about Hublitzia is that even if, there's lots of pictures of uh, Hublitzia plants coming up out of the snow. And usually what that is that, there's fresh snow that falls in the spring. So it's not actually coming up out of,
Yeah.
the hard frozen ground, but they come up really early. And it's in the hunger gap, when you're run out of all your stores traditionally and before your crops come, that's when these perennials really come to life because they have their roots and everything stored up. And as soon as it's warm enough, they start putting on growth. So in the north, having these types of plants are really important.
And Hablitzia, I believe, needs cold to germinate. So this would be a great one for colder climates.
Absolutely. You need to have at least a week or two of what's called stratification. So you can either put them cold in the fridge, but usually the best way to do it is to just have them outside at the right time of the year. And the seeds are very small, so there's not much chance that mice will find them and eat them. So those are the first three very early waves. And then the next wave is kind of a fun wave, and it's called strawberry spinach or Blitum capitatum is the Latin name for it. And it's actually a very rare ancient vegetable that dates back at least 400 years, which has sort of been rediscovered recently in old monasteries in Germany. And it's a very fun plant. This year, it's been so popular. I've actually sold all of the plants that I've grown, and have had to even dig up plants from my greenhouse to sell them because I ran out of stock. And it's fun because it makes little berries that kind of look like strawberries. They're quite tasty. They're not as tasty as strawberries, but they're quite good. And for that plant, the key thing to know is that when you're rinsing the berries, if you rinse them in a bowl and you pour the water out very slowly, you'll see a tiny little film of seed at the bottom of the bowl. And if you just put those in the window, then you're saving seed. So I think a lot of people with that plant will maybe just wash the berries and not think about it and just pour the water out along with all the seed. But every time you wash it, you can also save seed. And
Wow.
it's just as easy as just paying attention when you're washing the berries.
Amazing. And are these actual like it's not a fruit. Is it a fruit or is it just the this
Yeah, well, it's just like a berry, like a strawberry is the same. If you look at a strawberry, it'll have little tiny seeds in the
Mhm.
berry. So in that sense, very similar.
I've never heard of that plant.
Yeah, it's a,
Amazing. I thought I knew every Amaranth family member after 3 weeks of research.
oh, that's a favorite. And I can send you some seeds if you want. I have loads of seeds.
That would be great. Actually, now that how many did you say there are? Thousands? I guess not. It would take
2,000.
years, yes.
A lot of them are actually very weedy plants. So it's something to mention that just because a plant is an amaranth doesn't mean that you should save seeds from it.
Yes.
Some amaranth are very very not nice to have in your field and are considered to be top invasive species. So know your amaranth.
One of my favorite authors who writes about plants, Thomas, I think J. Elpole. Have you read his book Botany in a Day? It's a
No.
great book, but he says, quote, if you've ever weeded a garden, you've probably met an Amaranth family member.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. Oh, okay. So it's strawberry spinach. So is this something you chew? You eat the berries? Do you also eat the greens as well?
You can actually, the greens are really quite tasty. But I focus on the berries because we also have this idea that Stephen Barstow came up with called edimentals, which sort of edible ornamentals, where you want to be eating beauty. You don't just want to be eating for food. And so he has the world record in the salad with the most species in it, with 537 varieties of plants in it. And a lot of them are flowering plants. So if you get a picture of if you look up pictures of his salads, you'll see they're just the most gorgeous things. And these berries are sort of one of the things that you can add to salads to make them look beautiful, or you can just eat them as they are. They're quite a nice little snack.
Hmm. And what does this plant need to be healthy and thrive?
Well, this is the thing with all the amaranth plants is that they really are not picky, and a lot of them are C4 plants, which means that they're more efficient at doing photosynthesis work than most plants, which are C3 plants. And that means that they can tolerate tougher conditions. So they tolerate a drought, a high heat, And generally, that doesn't really bother them much. In fact, they tend to thrive when it gets warmer, especially the taller ones like Amaranth Hybridis, sort of the proper amaranth plants.
These plants would be very useful then with climate chaos that's occurring.
Absolutely. And that's a good point that you mentioned that, because it's one of the things that I'm working on, is to try and select plants for Nordic conditions, amaranth plants for Nordic conditions. And I'm doing that by sowing them earlier than you should sow them, which means that I'm getting a fail weight that's much higher than normal. But the good news there is that I'm selecting out. So I'm putting selection pressure on my plants by selecting out the ones that don't make it through the tough bottlenecks. And we're doing that on purpose, because we're trying to get these plants to adapt to the extreme ends that
Mm.
you'll get in weather. The further you go towards the north, the more extreme things become. So that's a part of the work we're doing in the Norwegian seed savers.
Yeah, it's fascinating and tragic. I mean, it's great you're doing that work, but it's sad that we are dealing with this reality.
It is, but the fun thing about it at the same time, I mean, there's always a trade-off. It's important to look at the opportunities that are coming now, and to try and think differently. One thing we can't afford to do is to think that everything's going to stay the same, and that our ecosystems are going to remain intact. They're not. We have to sort of choose how we're going to deal with our ecosystems and how we're going to help them evolve. If we just let them evolve on their own, it's going to be much tougher of a bottleneck for them to get through. But if we can act as keystone species to our ecosystems, observe and interact and work together in systems, then we can apply our consciousness to ecosystems building and ecosystems maintenance. And to do that properly, you really have to spend time in ecosystems observing, and you have to get down to the reproductive level. So you really have to get down to the seeds. And that's what the seed savers all around the world are all about.
Mm-hmm. And I think one of the tenets of your philosophy, you said that I think agriculture, it's a flaw in modern agriculture is when we shifted the responsibility of reproduction to large companies. Can you tell us just
Absolutely.
briefly what you mean by that?
Well, what I mean by that is that if you go back to the Green Revolution, we had sort of the hybrid revolution, where everything was about production, production, production. We wanted to get increase yields out of as small area as we can by applying technology, big machines, chemicals, and hybrids to ecosystems to create one type, basically a clone, a copy, a genetic copy over and over again in huge areas of exactly the exact same plant over and over again. So we basically digitalized our ecology. And by doing so, we broke a fairly cardinal rule of ecology, which is diversity. That ecologies, they maintain their integrity by evolving, and they do that by going out of productive mode and into reproductive mode. That's a part of the web of life. That's what protects ecosystems from disruption. And when we started to, in the 60s, just hybridize everything, then all of the people, the mom and pop operations who used to save their own seeds, suddenly they were told, well, that seed's just not good enough anymore because it just doesn't produce enough. Well, maybe that's true if you're looking at the world only from the perspective of human production and how much we can get out of ecosystems. But if you look at ecosystems over time and resilience, then you're creating a desert. You're creating a high entropy in your ecosystem by just nullifying all the diversity and just allowing only one hybrid to grow there. And what's worse is that the people who before had traditions of saving seeds were told, well, you can't save seeds from these hybrids, because if you do, what happens when you save seed from, usually the hybrids that you're sold are what's called F1 hybrids. It's the first generation hybrid. And they have hybrid vigor and uniformity, generally speaking. But then what happens in the second F2 generation is you get diversity. And that's a great thing from an ecosystem's perspective, but from a human perspective, that's just a mess. We think of that as just being a catastrophe, right? But
Hmm.
what breeders do, well, they'll play with that F2, and then they'll start selecting out, and they'll try and stable it in F3, F4, and they'll work all the way to F9, 10, 11, 12. They'll work with the plant for years until they create a new variety out of hybrids, right? And that's the way we used to do it. But what happened in the Green Revolution is that companies realized, if we know who the mother and father plants are, then we can make the same hybrid over and over again, and nobody else can do that because they don't know who the parents are. So they basically own the means of reproduction. by controlling the knowledge of how to reproduce that hybrid. And that's the trade-off was, the benefit was high production, high yields, but the trade-off was ecosystems with less and less diversity, and that's spread all around the world. And quite quickly, within 10 years, we saw huge losses in diversity. And that was in 1974 that the Seed Savers Exchange in the States decided we have to do something about this. We can't just let all this diversity disappear because these hybrids are taking over the markets. And that's when we had the beginning of the Seed Savers community seed bank revolution that's been spreading ever since all around the world, which is what Norwegian Seed Savers are a part of.
Wow, so really centralizing and having that power of seed saving and dictating what we can grow, and patenting seeds is all part of this too. So I really feel like your efforts and efforts of people all around the world to save seeds is so important right now.
Yeah, it's important also because I think that development of for people away from ecosystems is also a tragedy. We have this nature deficit disorder that's showing up all over the place, where people just don't know anything about ecology. They have no relation to it. They think, all they have to do is just go down to the store, and that's all they need to do. So it's kind of like outsourcing your ecological connection to machines and companies.
Hmm.
It's we wouldn't think of permanently being on respirators or permanently having IV drips to get our nutrition, but that's kind of what we've done if you think about it from an ecosystems perspective. We've just sort of decided to get connected intravenously. We're not connecting to our ecosystem enough. And so, for people like me, at least, if you're really going to connect with your ecosystem, you have to get down to the reproductive level, and you have to understand all the cycles in your ecosystem, not just the nutrient cycles and the energy flows, but also the reproductive flows.
For listeners who think, oh my gosh, that sounds so overwhelming, I think you do say that amaranth is a great family for apprentice seed savers to start with.
Absolutely. It's one of the easiest families. It's almost impossible not to save seeds from amaranth plant if you just let a few of them, not if you don't eat a few plants, you'll have seed the next year. It's pretty much that simple. And a lot of them will even self-seed.
Yeah, that's my favorite type of plant. But also, if you think I don't have time to save seed, at least hang out with some seed savers.
Yeah,
So you can
absolutely.
benefit.
Yeah.
Yes, it's great to support people that are saving seed in your community if possible. So we've gone into seed saving is very easy with these plants. Are there any other amaranth plants that you include in your 9-month sojourn into the amaranth world?
Absolutely. So we've kind of come to the end of the spring waves, and we're moving on into the summer. And in the summertime, we start to get to the bigger amaranth plants, what we think of when we think of amaranth. And the two species that I focus on there are Amaranth Tricolor and Amaranth hybridis, which are traditionally just called leaf amaranth and seed amaranth. And so the seed amaranth is what we usually think. That's the tall plant that can be, anywhere from 2 to 4 meters tall. And the leaf amaranth are sort of small, bushy amaranth plants, which are quite popular in India and Asia. And one book that I've read is called The Seeds of Cocopelli, which is written by a really great group of people in France who are seed savers, and they really are interested in amaranth, and they've looked at the nutrition values in amaranth, and they found that amaranth is an excellent source for iron, calcium, protein, vitamin C, E, and B. And if you look at, for instance, the leaf of amaranth compared to tomatoes, then the leaves have 3 times more C vitamin, 15 times more iron, and 40 times as much calcium.
Wow. That's really impressive. Also, protein. Aren't amaranth, the grain amaranth, isn't it really high in protein?
Absolutely. So the grain amaranth has somewhere between 16 and 18% protein. And the World Health Organization has a sort of a 1 to 100 scale, protein scale, amino acid score. And amaranth there scores 75. And if you compare that to wheat, which gets a score of 60, and soya that gets 68, corn gets 44, and milk gets 72. So that means that amaranth has a better protein score than milk.
That is a great thing for people, vegan diets and vegetarian diets. This is a great way to get your protein.
It really is. It really is. And yeah, so those two plants, the Amaranth Tricolor and Hybridus, I sort of sow them together or at the same time. And I love that wave, those waves when they get to the full peak, because that's sort of the sign of summer, the peak of summer, when you've got the greenhouse just overflowing with amaranth. And I don't actually eat the seed of amaranth, because I have this whole philosophy about eating photosynthesis as well, which we could talk about at another point. And the amaranth gives so much leaf material, and you can do cut it and come again on both the leaf amaranth and the seed amaranth. And yeah, for me, those plants are amazing. And it's also a little bit about the culture and sort of the way in which sort of the West and Europe dominated cultures. I mean, the Amaranth family plants were the sacred plants of the people of Mexico for 5,500 years. Is one of the 5 core crops of the Aztecs. And when the Spanish came, they basically outlawed it because it was a holy plant.
I read about that. Oh, and they punished people for growing it or handling it.
That's right. But what's amazing is that it sort of, through globalization, it made its way to India, where it became called, it was in India, they call it Ramdana, which means the grain sent by the gods. So it was a holy plant in Mexico, and then it became a holy plant in India and Nepal. And it's much more popular there now than it is in the Americas. But there's some interesting traditions in the Americas. One of them that I find quite worth mentioning is in Peru, peasants use the stem of amaranth for its high calcium content. They burn the stem and mix the ashes with water, and then they soak maize in it for making dough for tamales. And what that does is it adds vitamin to the maize-based diets. So they're using something that you wouldn't think you would use, which is the stalk of the amaranth, to get the vitamins out of it to add to their maize.
That's amazing. I didn't know the stem was edible. I know that the seeds were actually, and people prepare them, they either pop them or roast them, I believe, and then they make a porridge out of them, which I want to try. Do you know if you have to heat up the seeds for them to be healthy for you, or do you have any idea?
I actually haven't eaten amaranth seeds, which I should definitely try. But as far as I know, you have to prepare them somehow, either roast them or cook them. I know they make some sort of bars, like sweet bars, out of them in Mexico. It's quite popular.
Yeah, I looked up some recipes. They look really delicious, kind of like sesame seeds. They're really tiny. They look like quinoa almost, which is also another member of this family.
Oh, I didn't know that quinoa was also in the Amaranth family.
Yes,
Huh,
at
thanks
least
for that.
I think that the Amaranth family, and you probably know this, I think the goosefoot family was incorporated into Amaranth,
That's
I
right.
believe. Yeah, and so I think quinoa is a member of that family.
Quinoa, we definitely grow that in the Norwegian seed savers as well. In fact, Steve in Barstow has a variety that's from Chile, which is sort of one of the more southern varieties of quinoa, which of course we're looking for something that would be at the extreme southern end if we're going to try and grow that in the extreme northern end where we live.
I know quinoa has, I think it's called saponin, which is like that. You have to
That's
wash the
right.
quinoa, right? And I believe that amaranth either doesn't have that or has much less.
Right, exactly. And with the quinoa, you can also eat the leaves of the quinoa, just like you can with any of the other plants.
Wow, I didn't even know. How interesting. And another use for grain amaranth, which sounds really great, is grinding it into a flour and then baking with it. And then you get all those added nutrients along with your wheat or whatever else you're baking with.
Exactly. Yeah.
It sounds like then, Andrew, that you really focus on eating the leaves of the amaranth family plants and not so much the grain, at least not yet.
That's right. For me, maybe I should talk about that a little bit. I'm trying to understand, more and more about ecosystems as I interact with ecosystems. And one of the, when you study ecology, one of the events that's really interesting to look at is something called the symbiogenetic event. And that happened 1.8 billion years ago when the world only had single-celled organisms. Basically, what happened was 2 separate lines of single-celled organisms merged, and that's why it's called the symbiogenetic event. And out of that merger, you got mitochondria, right? And mitochondria are inside cells. They're sort of like the battery or the engines inside of cells, and cells that need a lot of energy, like your eye cells, your liver cells, your heart cells, have thousands of mitochondria in them. And the mitochondria you get directly from your mother, right? So it's not a part of the double helix. It's separate genetically from the double helix. And what's interesting about that is that it has that symbiogenetic event is the origin of multicellular life. So you have the three kingdoms, right? Plants, animals, and fungi all come out of that one symbiogenetic event. And so basically everything that we think of as life, or most of what we think of as life, at least multicellular life, comes from that event, including photosynthesis. That also comes out of that event. So mitochondria and photosynthesis have the same origin. And there's a symbiotic relationship between them too. And what a lot of people are doing research on these days, looking at how do you maintain good mitochondrial health. And what they're finding is that you need to be eating a lot of chloroplasts to be having healthy mitochondria. And how do you get that? You get that from eating fresh leaf, right? And if you look at our strongest cousins, the gorillas, what is it they eat all day long? They're eating leaves. That's all they do. They just spend the whole day eating leaf, right? So for me, at least, I feel like I call it riding the sun, because you get, the sun's energy there's an 8-minute delay from the sun until it reaches the plant. And if you're eating the plant right after it's been alive, I usually pick it and eat it right away if I can, or at least I try not to let it wait very long. But I'm eating straight sunlight. That's the way it feels. And that feeling of health, of eating a healthy ecosystem, there's no delay in the energy from the sun to you and from the plant to you. It's not going to be stored. It's not going to be going through some, monstrously large loop like a lot of people have buying their vegetables from stores or whatever. That to me is a big part of maintaining mitochondrial health.
Interesting. And not so much processing. You're getting it directly from the
true.
plant. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, that's the idea, basically, is to have something green or red to eat all the time. And amaranth has a lot of red in it as well.
Which is all that vitamin A, right? And I also think one thing I learned too about at least the grain amaranth is that it does have something called Lunacin in it, which is a peptide that's anti-inflammatory and they believe cancer prevention benefit.
That makes sense. No, I mean, there's just a kind of a sense of strength that you have when you eat amaranth, at least for me. You feel invigorated by it. There's another plant in here that I would like to mention as well, which is chard. I steward a specific variety, which is called Syrian Medieval Chard, which I got originally from the Roughwood seed collection in the States. And that's a really interesting story on its own. There was the name of the person who collected it was Ralph Weaver, and he was in Homs, Syria in 1948. He's the grandfather of William Royce Weaver, who's the head of the Roughwood seed collection. And the interesting story about that is that after the Green Revolution in Syria, they did the same thing there, where they pretty much replaced all the old cultivars with hybrids, and this variety disappeared, or at least it mostly disappeared from Syria. And last fall, I was at a gathering of community seed banks called Let's Liberate Diversity in France, and I met some peasants there from Lebanon. And I gave them some seeds from this medieval Syrian chard, and they were extremely happy to get it because they said that this plant had been, had disappeared, and it used to be what they used to make dolma, which is a special kind of a meal that they make down there, where you sort of wrap meat in leaves, and very often people get that wrapped in wine, grape leaves. But the original dolma was actually with this Syrian medieval chard. And the difference is that the medieval chard is an older variety, so the leaves are more, they roll better, whereas Swiss chard will crack if you try to roll it. So it's fun to be in a seed saving link with people who've done good work to find varieties and then save them, and then to know that you can complete a cycle and give it back again to the place where it comes from, and then have people be grateful for that. There's very few experiences like that beat that kind of an experience.
Ah, that's so wonderful. And its plants are really living history.
Yeah.
How rewarding to bring that plant to people where the plant originated. I love that story. And so is this a plant that the Syrian medieval chard, is this something that is easy to grow? It sounds like almost all amaranth are very easy to grow.
They're super easy. And this plant, for me, I found it's the fun thing about working with diversity is you see how different plants work together. And I grow my own garlic, hardneck garlic, and hardneck garlic. You put it in the ground. There's the rule there is 10, 10, 10. You know, October is the 10th month, 10 centimeters apart, 10 centimeters deep. That's all you need to remember. But then you harvest it in sort of midsummer or mid to late summer. And then you have to have something ready to go in the ground then. And of course, for an amaranth lover like me, what I do is I pre-cultivate some Syrian chard in little plugs. And as soon as I take out the garlic, I put the plugs in. And then like last winter, I was eating chard, past snow. There was snow all around the chard. I kept eating it. And it didn't have any, it doesn't really affect them that much. So, you can keep eating the chard till quite late. And it's kind of like having a fridge, right? At least in Norway, it's like, well, it's, you just go outside and collect it instead of storing it in your fridge.
I love that. So it sounds like there's an amaranth for every climate, and it sounds like they are easy to grow. And I know they adapt to disturbed soils. You don't have to baby them. One thing that I did read about was that just like I know chard and beets have oxalates in them, which if you eat too many of those, I think it can be hard on your kidneys. Do you have any ways to combat that? Or like spinach has that as well?
Yeah. Well, I mean, the most important thing is to not overdo any one wave, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you kind of notice when your system tells you, okay, it's too much of one thing. You need to move on to something else. And then it's important to listen to your body when that's happening. But basically, you traditionally, in one of the meals that I make a lot is a South Asian meal called palak paneer, which basically just means spinach with cheese. And so if you add a little bit of a cream or milk or cheese to the meals that you're making, and that kind of balances it out a little bit. That's one thing you can do.
Are you cooking these greens too, or eating them raw, or both?
Both.
Yeah.
Yeah. I
Okay.
mean, like just yesterday we had the palak paneer, and then we also had salad, and there was amaranth varieties in the salad as well.
And so amaranth, it's easy to grow. And do you have any propagation tips? It sounds like if they self-seed, they just want to grow and be alive. So they
This is
don't
the
have to
thing,
be
right?
babied.
So I have another philosophy, which is sow your weeds, right? So don't wait for weeds to grow, sow them. Because if you're waiting for a weed, if you're disturbing the soil and then you're gonna wait a week or two before you plant something, trust me, the weeds are already growing. So if you have edible weeds that you're going to be able to eat, then you can actively weed. And the interesting thing about all amaranth plants is that they're very easy to weed. You pull on an amaranth plant, it comes right out of the ground. It's not a stubborn plant. So what I do is basically I intentionally, and you have so much seed. So it's just your bottleneck is not the seed at all. So you just sow a huge amount, you use it as ground cover, and that's a much better thing than a mulch, actually, because the mulch is a dead plant, which is inferior to a living plant. You want to have living plants in your soil as much as possible. And so amaranths are excellent for that. So I use them as ground cover all over the place, one of several. But then there's also one thing you need to know is that you want to have other plants that you can eat with amaranth. And then you go to traditional cuisine and you'll find stuff like fenugreek, which is called meta. It's an Indian plant that's very easy to grow. I grow it as well in Norway. It's a nitrogen binder, and it's a cut and come again, and you just cut it and add it to any kind of amaranth meal, and it's a very nice supplement. It gives a nice taste to the amaranth meal. And that's
Interesting.
another ground cover crop, that nitrogen binding. And yeah, so there's all kinds of tricks that you can do when you get into growing in waves. You can see just wave after wave and how it's kind of like an orchestra, right? It becomes kind of like your greenhouse or your ecology is an orchestra. And you can almost see the music happening in your environment when you get aligned with it. And if you know when to sow, and you know when to harvest, and you know when to transplant, and you know when to save seeds, it's like living in a song that's
Wow.
constantly changing, and it's gorgeous.
And
And
it,
the
it
and the
tastes good
ecosystem
too.
notices it. Tastes good, it's nutritious. All the
Hmm.
bees love it. The insects come to your farm because they see all the diversity. They realize this is a place where there's a steady flow of energy. steady flow of nutrients, right? And that brings in the birds, right? And the birds then they control the predators, and and then you build this web of life out of your ecosystem, and that's how it should be. It shouldn't just be one hybrid of everything identical. That's where all the problems come in. You're creating a vacuum. You're creating disorder, entropy in your ecosystem. You want to be lowering your entropy, having less, creating more order, and having that order come in waves so that you can live in harmony with it.
You really paint a wonderful picture of how when we participate with nature and we create the conditions for life to happen, and you're planting your weeds, that good things come out of that. And I think it really stokes our connection to nature. And for me, that really enlivens me, especially with what's going on in the world right now. I feel like I need all the support and inspiration I can get. And one of the only things lately that has helped raise me above despair is being around plants and nature.
I totally agree with you. It saved my life. I was totally depressed about the way the world was going, and if it hadn't have been for ecology and my connection there, I don't know what would have happened. And I can see that that's happening all over the place. This year has been extreme in the amount of people who want plants and seeds. I had basically wiped out half of my seed bank this year
Mm.
because there's so much demand. People just ordering and ordering seeds, and some seed organizations have had up to 15 times the demand for seeds as normal. So it's people are understanding, that they can't just rely on, the structure of society to support them. That we need to sort of go back to a bit more a little bit more of a grounding, and a relationship to our ecology. And so for me, I think that's really going to be a big part of the solution in terms of global warming as well. I think it's once people start to connect with ecology and they realize, sort of get down onto the wavelength that plants are on and animals are on, then you can more easily see what makes sense and what doesn't make sense.
It's like the tickets to the plant symphony are selling out.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
standing room
Luckily, we
only.
can grow more of them easily. Yeah. The more people we have
Yes.
saving seeds, the better it gets. Yeah.
And for listeners who are thinking, which I lived for years without any gardening space, who are thinking like, oh, how can I connect to nature without being having a place to grow food? Do you have any suggestions?
We have in our Norwegian Seed Savers, we have an urban guild as well that works just with cities. I mean, there's so many new ways of getting a hold of land. There's in Scandinavia now. There's an app. I forget the name of it right now. There's an app that connects people who have garden space with people who need garden space. Right. So the idea thing is really to just there's usually a shortage of people who want to work with gardens and an excess of gardens. Right. So it's actually not really a problem. You just have to find somebody who has garden space and then connect with them somehow. So yeah, I don't think that's. I mean, of course, I can understand if you're living in the city. There in Oslo, for instance, where we're living, we're now working on rooftop projects. I'm working on a project in the Oslo center, which is going to be the largest edible rooftop garden in northern Europe. And
Wow.
we also have, yeah, we have several urban projects right down in the by the opera on the in the Oslo fjord. We have a big garden, urban garden, and it's also sort of a social get together and a place where we can try out all kinds of diversities of how seed saving in the city works. It's quite different there because the chance for crossing is much higher. But then again, the chance for something beautiful to come out of that is also much higher. So yeah, connect to your local seed saving organization. That would be my first tip. Find a seed saving organization near you, and there's going to be one, and then you'll find the people who are saving seeds, and that's what made for me was like a quantum leap from working in ecosystems and not really understanding much, and then suddenly being connected with a whole national organization of people who have all this genetics and have all this knowledge. So, yeah.
We're getting close to the end of our interview, and I'm curious. I think you shared this already with your beautiful analogy about the symphony of and the orchestra of plants. But what do you like most about working with Amaranth?
Wow, no, that's a good question. I mean, I think I wrote this article called Ecosystems Resonance, in which I talk about how, I sort of liken working with ecology to surfing. It is very similar. It takes a lot of work in the beginning. You sort of have to paddle out, right? But at some stage, you are able to jump up on the board. If you're lucky, you catch a good wave, and then you're off and you're riding, and it's a totally different experience than paddling out. And the more you do that, the less effort it takes to paddle out, because you know how to do it. And then the longer your wave rides will be, and the more quickly you'll be able to spot a good wave. And that's this whole experience that I've explained to you with everybody now with Amaranth. That's just one family. But we have many other families, right? So if you look at the nightshade family, I could tell you exactly, do a whole other podcast just on nightshades.
That would be
Right?
great.
And the same thing with beans, right? We have, or cabbage, right? So you can do this with any family. And my experience is that once you have a connection to one plant, and I'm talking about the reproductive connection, you connect it to its reproductive cycle, and then you understand, okay, that plant is just one in a variety, and that variety is just one in a species, and that species is just one in a genus, and that genus is just one genus in a family, and that there are many families, right? In the Norwegian seed savers, we have guilds for each family. And the nice thing is that once you connect to how families work and you sort of see all the nuances between them, then you're sort of looking at the rainbow of that family, and you learn more and more about how that family works. You're deeper and deeper connected to its reproductive cycle, and that's a real joy to be able to gain that kind of knowledge. So for me, once you've tried one, why not branch out and try new varieties? That's the fun of life.
And what was the gateway amaranth plant that you started with?
I think it actually was Syrian chard and spinach. Yeah, spinach.
Oh, that's great. Well, is there anything else you want to share with? Oh, first off, how can people find you online?
So if you go to norwegianseedsavers.no, there you will find contact information to get in contact with me, or you can just send me an email at andrew@norwegianseedsavers.no.
Perfect.
That's my email address.
And is there anything else you want to add?
Well, all I can say is I hope more people find the joy of connecting with ecosystems, and that we could all be riding waves. I think the world could be a totally different place if instead of surfing the net, we all started surfing ecosystems. I'd say the opposite of the big mantra in agriculture has been get big or get out, but I'd say get small and get in. Figure out how it works to get down on the small level with plants and connect deeply with them, and that's a beautiful thing. That's what we need more of.
Oh, that's wonderful. Well, thank you for your work, Andrew.
Thanks, Jill.
Thanks for listening to The Plant Report. The Plant Report is produced by Jill Cloutier and is a project of Sustainable World Radio. For more podcasts about plants, permaculture, and ecology, visit our website, sustainableworldradio.com, and you can also find us on iTunes, Facebook, and Twitter. The Plant Report is created for educational purposes only and is not intended to diagnose, treat, cure, or prevent any health condition. Thanks for listening, and don't forget to thank the plants for everything they do.